Welcome to the Urban Agenda. I'm David R. Jones, President and CEO of the Community Service Society of New York, an organization that for 150 years has addressed issues that affect the lives of the poor. As Congress begins its 104th session, the problems of the poor are very much on the minds of legislators. Since the November elections, we've heard about plans to dismantle the welfare system, deny support to mothers under 18, and to place young children in orphanages. Here to discuss what's ahead is Megan E. McLaughlin, Executive Director of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. Dr. McLaughlin is one of the city's best-known advocates for families and children. She has written and taught extensively on foster care, adoption, and welfare policy. Well, Megan, we're in it now. I think our viewers know that. The Clinton administration has already suggested that if the GOP plans go ahead, that more than 5 million children may lose benefits. What do you think is going to happen here?
Well, I think that it is fair to say, it's hard to say what's going to happen, because people are on welfare because they need financial assistance. They're not on it for their health. Right. And they're on it for a short period of time. Were they to be pushed off, I think they would end up in homeless shelters. Of course, some would find families with whom they could live, thereby making poor families poorer yet, and perhaps putting at risk an additional number of families, because if a poor family takes in another family, then that family gets poorer. Right. So that the consequences are hard to imagine, very frankly.
Well, the Federation, as CSS, goes back years. Obviously, yes. We've seen desperate times. We're wondering, however, as we go back through our archival material and looking at the destitution of children on the streets of New York almost 100 years ago, whether we may not be coming into a time when we'll see just that again.
But you know, even during those days, arrangements were made to take care of those who are poor. So now the discussion is to really abandon our help for the poor, to stop that. So it's a very new discussion. Right. It seems to me basically what they're saying is that if we cannot control the lives of these women, then we'll punish them. And we'll punish their children as well. And that's what's going on, because some of it is very unrealistic. To talk about putting children in orphanages is to ignore both the social and psychological costs and the economic realities, because it's so expensive. It's just not workable.
Well, two things we see, obviously. The poll data seems to indicate that people aren't willing to go for the jugular, at least of little
That's
kids.
Right.
But we're concerned, and I think you must be as well, that so much of this has been cast in racial terms, that the discussion on teenage mothers is basically about Black and Latino mothers. They don't seem to recognize that this kind of impact will impact far beyond just an inner city kid. This is going to be nationwide and predominantly impact the white poor as well.
Yeah, the subtext has been raised, and we use all kinds of code words. We talk about teen pregnancy, meaning teen pregnancy among Black and Latino. Many people believe that only Black and Latino people of color are on welfare. That is AFDC, Aid for Dependent Children. The fact of the matter is that about 39% of the people who receive aid for dependent children, that which we call welfare, are white. So that the impact will be great for poor people in general, and in particular for women. There seems to be a real bashing of women everywhere, and I think that we should recognize that the discussion about taking children from women, cutting AFDC affects women. Over 90% of the adults who are taking care of children and therefore receiving AFDC are women. So it's both anti-family, anti-women, and anti-children.
Well, I guess the question becomes, I guess, for viewers and everyone, what are we going to do about this? Obviously, there's a fight on, and at the moment, those forces that seem to want to penalize poor people are certainly in the ascendancy.
Well, we hear about them a lot. You know,
Right.
I wonder if there are many people listening to us now who have been on welfare.
Right.
It bothers me that You know, when you talk about alcoholism, people will come forward and they'll say, I am an alcoholic, or I have been an alcoholic. People with AIDS or HIV positive, they have acknowledged that in order for the public to understand the real impact, they must see the faces behind the disease. With AFDC, people have to hide because we have so degraded and those who have received it that it is hard to see the faces behind AFDC. And I think one thing we must do is to begin to say, look, we grew up using AFDC and here we are, we have made it. Or parents who have used it, some of whom are in office and hiding it. You know, why do we need to hide the fact that at one point or another you had to receive public assistance, but now you're contributing to the tax base?
One of the funniest engagements, just as you say, I was on a program some weeks ago with O'Rourke, the county supervisor of Westchester, who's very conservative on some of these issues, but he did admit that he and his entire family received welfare.
Sure.
I wish he had taken all the lessons to heart, because they were literally on welfare for many years. I mean, they would fit the profile of somebody mired in welfare dependency.
And yet, there he is now.
Right.
So that is one of the things that the listening audience can do. You know, the question is, what can I do? One of the things I can do, each person can do, is to become informed about the issue, not to accept the view that the majority of people who are receiving AFDC are on it for life. 66% of the people get off in 3 years or less, and that people are on it because they need it. It's not fun. And that in fact it has served and it continues to serve a useful purpose. It is not true that it creates all this dependency. Right. There's some people on welfare who should probably get off. But that's true of everything else that we know about.
There was an opinion piece in the New York Post, I think some days ago, which talked extensively about the problem of teenage mothers and how they are getting on welfare in order to, having more children rather, to get more money. What do you think about that kind of argument?
Well, in the first place, it is important to know that the number of young women
right.
between the ages of 15 and 19 who are on welfare, who receive AFDC, that has decreased over the past 10 years, and we're talking about less than 3% of those who are on welfare. So, you know, we're picking on a very small percentage of the welfare population. And of course, it's of concern to all of us that young people are having children, although that's not a new phenomenon in this country or in any other. Again, people who are listening, many of them were teen parents. Not all teen parents are doing a poor job raising their children. You know, we should not encourage young people to have children because they're themselves children. These are different times and they do not have the supports that are needed. Nonetheless, what are we going to do? Abandon them and their children? Many of them cannot stay with families because the family situations are not what they should be. Some do not have families. So,
well, this segregates perfectly. Obviously, what was used to be a silly notion of setting up mega orphanages is suddenly caught fire, particularly with some of the new conservatives in Washington. What is, without, obviously we're on...
The devil is in the details.
Yeah.
The devil, in this instance, the devil is truly in the details.
Right.
Because these are people who are talking about costs. They're concerned about costs.
Right.
And when they begin to develop the budgets, I think they will retreat without much advocacy. It will cost, at a minimum, about $35,000 to keep a child, at a minimum. And some have estimated $50,000 to $70,000 to keep one child in the kind of facility that they're talking about. Now, we know that this country has not done a good job with congregate care facilities. We do not need to go back to Oliver Twist. We don't need to do that. Do you recall New York City, 1987, was it? 88, when we had to struggle to close these institutions because kids were getting diseases and they were not being taken care of by the same adults. I remember going with the commissioner to visit some of them. That was about 87.
Right.
So we could look to our New York experience. Look at what's happening now to institutions for older citizens.
Right.
They are not the best. They require a lot of monitoring. And, you know, I think that these people will quickly realize that they cannot afford to put all of these children in institutions. Of course, I'm assuming that, you know, they're not concerned about the social and psychological costs to these children and families. For a pro-family administration, I think it is unconscionable that they should continue talking about ripping children away from their families because they're poor. You know, that it's just unconscionable. It's not the American way.
I was down in Washington recently, and I talked to the new Republican staffers of the Ways and Means Committee who are going to be dealing with looking at welfare, and they seemed somewhat hesitant about talking about orphanages. They were somewhat hesitant about talking about the issue of removing, not giving benefits to teen parents with who had young children. What they seemed to be very adamant about, however, was the notion of removing legal immigrants from the welfare rolls, and that seemed to be very serious. What would be the impact, in your view, on a place like New York or California or Texas of tinkering with that part of the contract?
91% of the people on AFDC are citizens already. So they're talking about the 9% who are permanent residents.
Yes.
And that's who pay taxes, by the way, because they're working legally.
Yes. So
I think it would have to be challenged in court because they are paying taxes. These are not non-taxpayers. So I am not a lawyer.
Right.
I would wonder, though, about the legality of it. But it's important to point, 91% of the people on AFDC are citizens. You know, it seems to me that the debate here is more about the myths that people have created. It's always easier to find a scapegoat.
Right.
And right now in this country, things are not going well. The middle class has been slipping for the past 20 years or so. And jobs have been fleeing. And many people who thought they were secure in blue-collar jobs have been losing their jobs. Rather than talk about the fact that we are not growing the economy, we are not producing enough jobs for the people we have now, we have decided to find an easy scapegoat and to talk about morality and thereby ignore the issue, ignore the fact that people need jobs that pay them enough so that they can take care of their families. First of all, so that they can start families. Very few people want to get married and start their families if they do not have adequate income.
It's interesting. One of the reasons that the idea of taking immigrants off the rolls in New York State and City is not so attractive is because it's not so easy to get only at immigrants who are considered somewhat unacceptable. We're not talking about Haitians. We're not talking about Dominicans. This would have an incredibly bad impact on, for instance, people who are fleeing the former Soviet Union, because they're one of the highest users of these kinds of transitional welfare services, and rightfully so. But I think people would like to paint this as an image of all those people they don't like. The trouble is these kinds of attacks will not discriminate, and I use that advisedly, between those immigrants of color who may not be quite as attractive to some people in America, as opposed to people who are in desperate affairs and are seeking asylum from really terrible condition. And I think we're going to have to keep hammering about that. I want to protect all immigrants who have a right to participate in this country and who have been allowed to come in here legally and without respect to color.
It's the same thing, you know. If you ask the average person about the complexion of those who are on welfare, I think they'd quickly say people of color. Similarly, it's interesting to me as an immigrant to note that only people of color are called immigrants. Somehow white Europeans and others who are white are not called immigrants. If you are Asian or if you are African American, from the Caribbean or from a Spanish-speaking country, you are ipso facto an immigrant. But we do not think about the Irish and the Italians and the Soviets as immigrants. Somehow, once they get here, they're regular Americans. And therein lies the problem. Too many people think that these policies will affect people of color only.
I think the other Republican idea that obviously is giving us some pause is the notion of abolishing cash payments to about 800,000 disabled or chronically ill kids who receive SSI. What do you think of that plan?
And who are unable to stay at home, because people do not understand that they receive this money so that they can take care of their disabled child or relative at home. Again, you know, it's inhuman. It's just,
well, it doesn't
inhumane.
even make cost sense.
It is
right.
The devil is in the details. You know, they're making these proposals. Theoretically, I'm not sure what the objectives are. I don't think they are either, because if the objective is to reduce costs, then it makes no sense. If the objective is to take people from their families and put them in institutions, that costs more. If the objective is to improve care, we know that that's not so. So that it would result in more people going into institutions. There is no debate about that. What else could happen to them? Because some of the money that these families get is used for other than medical services. It's not just medical services. So to assume that just to cover medical costs would be adequate, I think is to show that they have not studied the problem. And I hope that once they take more time to study the problems and then make social policy based on a better analysis, that they'll come up with much more intelligent and effective proposals.
I think you've touched upon something, though, earlier in our discussion, which I think is the core of this thing. I think people are so frustrated with their own stagnation in wages and their own fears for their children that they really want to find what's wrong with this system that's holding us back. And I think the political leadership has taken advantage of them. And this is not a Democratic or Republican thing. They don't have the solutions for wage stagnation. That's clear. We don't know how we're going to remain competitive in a world economy where people with lower or semi-skills or not adequate or appropriate skills are going to get the kind of wage increases that we got used to during the 50s, 60s, and part of the 70s. So they've now been convinced if we can just squeeze the welfare cost, that somehow this will result in improved living standard for working people. I think we're going to go through a period of time where this experiment will go on and there'll be a lot of suffering. But I don't think the politicians should feel particularly safe, because I think the anger is still going to be there if people don't deliver the goods. And at the moment, merely cutting a couple of more children off the rolls is not going to produce any kind of major stimulation to the American economy. And I think we have to keep hammering, even when it gets chilly out there, and no one's listening, that this is not the way to do it, and this is going to drag places like New York down real quick.
Well, you know, AFDC is 1% of the budget. So if we eliminated AFDC, I think that those people who are concerned about their own life chances and what's going to happen to their children should know that they will not be in any better position. And in fact, they may join the welfare rolls. You know, I'm very concerned. I had hoped that as more people understand that their own lives are fragile and that they have lost jobs and their but for the grace of God go I, that somehow they would have addressed this by becoming much more sympathetic to those who have fallen off the edge, albeit for a short time, rather than what has happened, which is that we have had some leaders who have really taken up the banner, and they have used a lot of misinformation, and I think that they have become very, some of it is just cruel. And I think to really castigate people who, for all kinds of reasons, have had to use public assistance for a short period of time is really immoral and inappropriate.
One of the reasons the conservatives managed to capture the agenda, obviously, were flaws in the existing welfare system.
There are flaws everywhere.
Absolutely.
It is not the only flawed program. Social Security is flawed, the IRS is flawed, the educational system is flawed, Congress is flawed. What isn't flawed?
Right. One of the arguments we used to discuss, there's a great interest in moving people off welfare who are, quote, fraudulently using the system. and it was interesting in the discussion, the last numbers that were heard in New York State, that the fraud rate is probably between 2 and 3%.
That's right. Lower than most other programs.
Well, as I keep saying, that basically I wouldn't want to hold bank executives to that standard, or else we'd have our prisons
really full.
Then
we'd improve them, though.
Then perhaps we'd improve them on that rate. But what would we do, given our druthers, if we could really actually talk about reforming welfare? What would we take this whole issue aside of what the conservatives are planning? What would we do to really make it a system that's humane?
In the first instance, I think we have to look at who is on welfare. And that 66% get off in 3 years.
Right.
I would leave that 66% alone. And then focus on those who stay on for a longer period of time. Because that has always been the major problem and the major concern of the American public. Those who seem to stay on for a longer period of time. And that I would not leave the 66% alone. I'd increase the AFDC limit, because to give people help and then say, but we really want you to suffer while we are helping you, is not really help. It's helpful, but that's not the best way to help. With that other 33% that stays on for a longer period of time, we are to analyze that population. Many of them need job training. Many need education. We know that if we provide education to some of these young women, that not only will they be off welfare, but their children will be assured middle-class status. Now, it's interesting to note that we balk at sending some of these young women to college, even if they are prepared and that's what they want to do. We say that's not a good investment. I think that's wrong. So I think we should target the population that stays on for a longer period of time and focus on education, job training. We must provide child care for all women. That is a big part of it. Of course, if we have health coverage for all, that also addresses part of the problem. These things are very interrelated. But I think we should focus on increasing the benefits so that people can in fact find a way out, and on providing training, education, and support services for those who are on it for a much longer period of time.
The other part of the Republican contract in this case really puts a lot of emphasis on work, and clearly any community wants work, and I guess we see that. What do you think the impact, how could you come up with a work program that wouldn't further penalize people on welfare and actually give them some experience that's useful?
Well, let me just say one thing. People want, work should pay.
Right.
That's what Mr. Clinton is saying. So that people who are working should earn more. So increasing the minimum wage should be part of this debate. I'm pleased to hear that that's being discussed now. But to have people who are working full-time, who are still below the poverty line, who must still apply for Medicaid because they have no coverage, is to set people up to fall off the edge.
Right.
And then when they fall into welfare, we demonize them. So that it's difficult to talk about welfare without talking about the working poor, because many people on welfare work. They just happen to be out of work for that period of time. There's a relationship, a dynamic relationship, between those who work at low wages and those who have to go on welfare.
There's an interesting thing, a little part of this that I've been fascinated with. Both state and city government have been laying off workers and talking about laying off workers for a long time. But because of the fact that the agencies they've been focusing on have large concentrations of women, both black and Latino women, there's a unique potential here of layoff of city workers who immediately have to rely on welfare for support.
That's right.
And therefore no net gain to the taxpayer, theoretically. And
there's a net loss.
Net loss. And theoretically a real destabilization. It becomes even worse because the suggestion is to force people on welfare to work, basically filling in those same jobs that were lost because of the layoffs. This becomes very bizarre.
But what, if you just think about that, take a few, put some faces to it.
Right.
What we're saying is that it is likely that some of these women who were laid off from HRA could be forced to go back to HRA once their unemployment runs out to the welfare to work program. as if these are women who didn't want to work in the first place. You know, women get, the majority of women get on welfare because of change in their marital situation, because of loss of jobs, you know, so that death in the family. These are the things that bring women into the welfare system. So the assumption that they do not want to work and take care of their own families has never been proved. Never been proved. And these same women might end up having to go back to these jobs in the welfare to work program.
It's interesting. You know, again, we're getting back to something we raised before, is what people should do about it. Everyone seems, at least the political leadership, and that's both the progressive and the conservative, seem incredibly reticent about taking any strong stands now in protecting these individuals. I mean, I just haven't heard it.
It's out of fashion. It's not politically correct these days, seriously, to talk about the poor. From all kinds of places, I'm hearing people talk about these welfare people as if, you know, we have bought into the myths. You know, we must admit that those who are anti-poor and anti some of the programs for the poor have really won the media battle. And too many, we do not have access to the press and to the media in the same way. So somehow the common person, some people on welfare have negative views about welfare. You know, and to be very frank, in the black community, you know, everybody knows the one welfare cheat. That same person who is on welfare knows the one welfare cheat, and somehow doesn't put it together and say, but I also know a number of people who are using welfare appropriately and whose children are benefiting. Rather, we focus on the one person who we don't like.
Right. And
I think that feeds the negative view, and that's something else that listeners can do. Stop that.
On that note, thank you very much, Megan. Despite the bravado talk by newly empowered conservatives in Congress, Americans are not quite ready to buy into the dump the poor policy. Polls clearly show that Americans are uneasy with the GOP proposal to deny aid to unwed teenage mothers and their newborn children. And even with the promise of block grants to the states, not all governors are convinced they should assume the federal government's welfare burden. As 1995 gets underway, the challenge will be to find the right mix of governmental help and compassion to spare those already burdened by poverty from suffering even greater harm. No society that considers itself civilized can do otherwise. This is David R. Jones for the Urban Agenda. Thank you.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.